Hello and welcome to today's module on literary theory and literary criticism. In today's lecture, we will be looking at something known as ecocriticism, and as always, we will be covering this lecture in two modules. Ecocriticism is a term that seems to have gained currency in a lot of currency in recent times. But what in fact is or what do you understand by ecocriticism? Simply defined, ecocriticism is the study of the relationship between literature and the physical environment, and this definition comes to us from a person known as Cheryl Glotfelty. Now, both the terms ecocriticism and green studies are used to denote this kind of a critical approach, which began in the USA in the late 1980s and in the UK in the 1990s. In the USA, the acknowledged founder of the movement of the school is the person that we just got the quote from, Cheryl Glotfelty, who along with a person known as Harold Fromm co-edited the Ecocriticism Reader, Landmarks in Literary Ecology. In 1992, she also co-founded what we know as ASLE. ASLE is basically the Association for the Study of Literature and Environment, and ASLE publishes its in-house journal called Interdisciplinary Studies in Literature and Environment, which started in publishing in 1993. So, as you can imagine, that is more or less where the thrust of the movement comes from the 80s onwards or early 90s. Therefore, due to such early influences, American ecocriticism was already a burgeoning academic discipline as an academic movement by the early 1990s and began developing its professional infrastructure of designated journals and literature. Now, as a concept though, ecocriticism first arose in the late 1970s at the meetings of the WLA. Now, the WLA is the Western Literature Association, a body whose primary field of interest is the literature of the American West. Now, in his introduction to a series of brief papers all titled "What is Ecocriticism?", Michael P. Branch traced the word ecocriticism back to William Ruckert's 1978 essay Literature and Ecology, an experiment in ecocriticism. So, that is where we get the original term from. Now, according to Branch, both the terms ecological and ecocriticism lay dormant in the critical vocabulary up until about the 1989 WLA conference, which was where Cheryl Glotfelty revived the use of the term. Glotfelty also urged its adoption to refer to a blanket critical field known as the study of nature writing. Ecocriticism, as it now exists in the USA, takes its literary bearings from three major 19th century American writers whose work celebrate nature, the life force and the wilderness as manifested in America. Now, these three very important and famous writers are Ralph Waldo Emerson, who lived between 1803 and 1882, Margaret Fuller, who lived between 1810 and 1850, and David Henry Thoreau, who lived between 1817 and 1862. As you can see, they were contemporaries, they lived in almost the same time frame, and they wrote in exceedingly similar ways with similar concern. Now, as you can probably imagine, they were all American and they were all members of a group of New England writers, essayists and philosophers who were known collectively together as the Transcendentalists. Transcendentalism was the first major literary movement. This is a side note. Transcendentalism was the first major literary movement to achieve a sort of cultural independence from the pre-existing European models. Now, Emerson's own first short book was called Nature, and it was first published anonymously in 1836 and can be seen as a reflective essay on the impact that the natural world had on him. It was voiced rather powerfully and dramatically, and as we can see from some of these lines, and these lines are taken from chapter 1 of Nature. This is the quote. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of a special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. I am glad to the brink of fear, unquote. Now, as you can imagine, this is a quote from nature, and you can see how passionately, eloquently, and dramatically he cites nature's influence on him. Similarly, Margaret Fuller's first book was Summer on the Lakes, which is also an equally powerfully written journal of her encounter with the American landscape as her education as the first woman student at Harvard. Now, Thoreau's own important work that we know today is Walden, and is an account of his 2-year stay from 1845 onwards in a hut that he had built on the shores of a pond called Walden Pond. Now, this was a couple of miles away from Concord, his hometown of Concord in Massachusetts, and it is perhaps the ultimate and classic account of dropping out of modern life and seeking out to renew itself by a sort of return to nature. The film Into the Wild that you might be some of you might be familiar with is also heavily inspired by Thoreau's stay at Walden. Together, these three books can be seen as the foundational works of the American eco-centered writing. Now, by contrast, the British version, the UK version of eco-criticism, or green studies as they call it, takes its bearings from the British romanticism of the 1790s rather than the American transcendentalism of the 1840s. Now, you might be familiar with the Romantic movement. We have critics and poets like William Wordsworth and Coleridge. The existence of these two distinct national variants of the ecological approach is similar to the situation of British cultural materialism and American new historicism respectively. So, this is basically more or less two aspects of the same phenomenon, two models of the same cultural phenomenon. In other words, the preferred American term is eco-criticism, whereas green studies is frequently used when referring to this in the UK. Also, another key difference between the two approaches is that the American version of the moment is rather celebratory in tone, and this is something that more hostile critics, more hostile, harder left-leaning critics dismissively call the phenomenon of tree hugging. So, the American version is rather celebratory, while the British version is more concerned with, is more occupied with environmental degradation and the analysis of governmental, commercial, and even neo-colonial interventions. For instance, we have Jonathan Bates, who published The Song of the Earth in 2000, and in the work, Bates argues that colonialism and deforestation have frequently gone together, and they have gone hand in hand oftentimes. Now, some common principles of this phenomenon known as eco-criticism, irrespective of national variants, are as follows. The most fundamental point perhaps is the eco-critic's rejection of the notion that everything is socially or linguistically constructed. So, nature is something that really exists, that really is a physical entity for the eco-critic, and it is present as an entity which affects us and which we can affect in turn, even fatally, if we are not careful, if we go on mistreating our natural environment and resources. They maintain that nature is not reducible to an abstract concept, and which we can conceive as a part of our cultural practice. They reject that kind of understanding of nature. And at this point, you might recall how in theory, in general, we tend to see our external world as something that is socially or culturally or perhaps even linguistically constructed. It is something that is already textualized into discourse. However, eco-criticism calls this kind of an understanding into question. Now, a good example for the kind of resistance that the eco-critics offer to such an understanding can be found in Kate Soper's frequently quoted remark, and this is taken from her seminal book What is Nature. In the book, she very emphatically points out that it is in language that has a hole in the ozone layer, and that is precisely the kind of attitude and stance that most eco-critics adopt. Eco-criticism thus repudiates the foundational belief in the constructedness, which is a significant aspect of contemporary and modern literary theory. The essence of ecocriticism's intervention in theory has been to challenge this very notion. However, this should not be taken as an implication that the ecocritics hold a very naive or a very pre-theoretical approach to a notion of nature, because in the case of ecocriticism, some of the most heated exchanges have been between the American Wordsworth critic Alan Lew and the various ecocritics, including Jonathan Bate, who we just mentioned. Jonathan Bate is also the author of the seminal work called as Romantic Ecology. Now, the key argument on this debate from Lew's position is that by calling something natural and seeing it as something that is simply given is usually a way of avoiding the politics which has clearly transformed it or made it that way. For example, let us look at this 19th century children's hymn by C.F. Alexander, which has these lines, quote, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, he made them both high and lowly and ordered their estate." He, of course, here implies God. Now, this is taken from C.F. Alexander's children's hymn that came out, or that originally came out in the 19th century. Now, the problem with the poem, as you have probably guessed, is that it is obvious from the example given here in the poem that social inequality is being naturalized here. We have these lines that the rich man is in his castle and the poor man is at his gate, and that is because God made it that way. So, what we have here is that a clear case of social inequality is being naturalized as something that is God given, and thus the situation becomes something that is inescapable from, when actually it is we know today as something that is a product of a very specific set of politics at work. It is a result of political systems and power structures that have actually in fact put the rich man in his castle and the poor man at his gate. Now, this is also perhaps symptomatic of the Marxian dictum that religion is the opium of the people. Thus, according to Lew, there is no nature. In other words, nature is nothing more than a mere anthropomorphic construct that is created by Wordsworth and the rest for their own convenient purposes. Now, this is a remark that is often a frequent target in ecocritical writing and has been kind of paradoxically too a valuable stimulus to the definition and crystallization of the very positions that ecocriticism adopts today. For example, we have Terry Gifford's response to the statement that whereas Lew is right to identify nature as a mediation, he is wrong to deny the general physical presence that exists on one side of that mediation. And therefore, the nature versus culture dichotomy or the nature versus culture distinction is problematized by acknowledging that such distinctions are not always absolute and clear cut. The existence of such distinctions is not undermined by the existence of intermediate states. To give you an analogy, the existence of the color gray does not quite destabilize the existence of the color black or white, and this is precisely the kind of logic that this argument adopts. Thus, in the context of ecocriticism, we have nature and culture that are both partaking in a realm where both are equally valid. Now, this would be to assume a sort of a continuum or a spectrum of sorts, a series of adjoining and overlapping areas which gradually move from nature on the one end to culture on the other end. That is, from pure wilderness on the one hand, comprising of perhaps inaccessible deserts and wide open oceans, which almost signify a zero level of human interaction, from then on to a spectrum that includes hills and fields, and then perhaps something that includes community parks and public gardens, and then on to a completely artificial landscape comprising of perhaps the New York City skyline. All kinds of writing, including nature writing, can be placed on this spectrum somewhere, depending upon their degree of engagement with physical nature and the alternating cultural forces. Thus, British Romantic writing and American Transcendental writing, which shows a predominant interest in mountains and prairies and waterfalls and grasslands. So, all those kinds of writing would be segregated to one end of the spectrum, while other works such as those represented by novels like Huckleberry Finn or Moby Dick would follow suit and occupy certain other spaces within this very spectrum. Literary spaces often perform an anthropocentric function, which is to say, in a human centered approach, natural objects are often seen as existing for the sake of human benefit. Now, this is a point that deep ecology strongly resists and opposes, and this is where Bates makes a distinction between light greens, his idea of light greens and dark greens, and this distinction is given to us by Bates in The Song of the Earth. Now, the light greens are environmentalists who value nature because it nurtures humanity and contributes to our well-being. They advocate responsible forms of production and consumption and engaging with nature. The dark greens, on the other hand, are the deep ecologists who take a more radical stand and are people who maintain that technology is the problem and can never be a part of the solution. They recommend a going back to nature and prefer the term nature over the more anthropocentric term environment. They hate using the term environment because it implies something that is anthropocentric. The point that is repeatedly made by ecocritics is that for the first time in human history, we have nothing known as true wilderness. True wilderness does not exist anywhere on this planet anymore, and that is because every region on the planet is affected by some sort of human activity, including that of global warming and other such anthropocentric problems such as toxic waste or nuclear fallout. So, even if you take the remotest part of Alaska, you might be familiar with the picture of a polar bear trying to floating away on a piece of ice. So, regardless of wherever whichever landscape you approach, it has been irreparably and consistently damaged by human activity. Now, they also maintain that issues of gender, race and class cannot any longer exhaust the range of concerns that literature and criticism ought to have. That is how we normally see theory engaging with. Theory is concerned with questions of power, of gender and race and class, etc. And in other words, ecocritics, while seeking to contribute to rectifying injustices in the area of gender, race and class, they maintain that this is indeed a very noteworthy, praiseworthy aim for critics and theorists to have, to identify injustices in the areas of gender, race and class, etc. However, it does not really help us to ignore the fact that there will not be a place to live for us to live if we can't reverse or avoid the inevitable doom, the inevitable environmental catastrophe that we are heading towards. So, to put it in another way, it would be like trying to improve the working conditions on the fated on the ship Titanic while the ship was going full speed on its way to hit an iceberg. So, if that is a more important concern for us, we should be taking care of that first instead of perhaps trying to improve the working conditions. So, while this is indeed a very praiseworthy aim to have, an ecocritical concern, it is infinitely more relevant to our cause. An ecocritical reading of a literary text incorporates a consideration and an engagement with the kind of issues we just mentioned. Sometimes it is just a matter of approaching perhaps a very familiar text with new alertness to the dimension or to the issues that the text represents, a dimension which was perhaps not received the kind of environmentally conscious and sensitive reading which was always there in the text. And with that, we will stop this module. When we come back for the next module, we will analyze this case with a short piece of text. Thank you very much. See you next module.